It was the kind of night only a hospice nurse would understand. Quiet, heavy, suspended somewhere between life and death. The clock had just passed 2 a.m., and the halls of St. Agnes Hospice were silent except for the soft hum of oxygen machines. Outside, rain tapped against the windows, slow and rhythmic, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Sarah Miller, a nurse with 10 years of hospice experience, moved through the corridor like she had countless nights before, measured, calm, but tired. She'd grown used to the stillness, to the whispered prayers and final breaths that filled these rooms. But that night, something was different. Her patient, Evelyn Carter, had been fading all evening. The monitors had been silent for hours, only a faint, irregular heartbeat remaining. Evelyn was 82 years old, frail, pale, her once lively eyes closed beneath thin, translucent lids. Sarah had been at her bedside for most of the night, sitting in the dim glow of the bedside lamp, watching the inevitable approach. She'd already called the family earlier that evening, explaining gently that the time was near. Evelyn's daughter, Laura, had come, kissed her mother's forehead, and whispered goodbye before leaving just after midnight. Sarah promised to stay with Evelyn until the end. Now, in the stillness of the early morning, Sarah reached for Evelyn's hand. It was cool to the touch, no pulse. She leaned in, her stethoscope pressed against Evelyn's chest. Silence. The familiar final silence that every hospice nurse comes to recognize. Sarah exhaled softly. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered. "You can rest now." She noted the time on her chart. 2:16 a.m., but before she could reach for the sheet to cover Evelyn's face, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a flicker in the air, a faint intake of breath that didn't belong to her. Sarah froze. She leaned closer, her heart suddenly pounding. Evelyn's fingers twitched. Then, impossibly, her chest rose. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Evelyn?" she whispered, half afraid of the sound of her own voice. Evelyn's eyes opened, wide, alert, impossibly clear. Not the clouded, vacant gaze of someone near death, but sharp, knowing. And then Evelyn spoke. Her voice was soft, but certain. "He's waiting for me at the river." Sarah felt her stomach drop. She stumbled back a step, gripping the side of the bed for balance. "Evelyn?" The old woman smiled faintly, her gaze unfocused but peaceful. "Well, I can see him," she said. "He's standing by the water." Sarah didn't know what to say. Every medical instinct screamed that this wasn't possible. Evelyn's pupils were reactive. Her breathing, slow but steady. Her hand warm again. She had no IV running, no oxygen. There was no logical explanation. The rain outside intensified, drumming harder against the window. In the glow of the bedside lamp, the shadows seemed to move. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, not from fear, but from awe. She had witnessed hundreds of deaths, but never this. For a long moment, nurse and patient simply looked at each other. Evelyn's eyes seemed to shimmer, as if reflecting something unseen. Then, just as suddenly as it began, her breathing slowed again. Her eyelids fluttered once, and she was gone. Sarah stood there in the silence, the rain softening once more to a whisper. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. She checked the time again, 2:19 a.m. 3 minutes after she'd already pronounced her dead, her voice, soft and trembling, closed the memory. I'd seen hundreds of deaths, but that night, I stopped believing that death was the end. A week before that night, life inside St. Agnes Hospice carried its familiar rhythm, a gentle, steady hum that only those who've worked in end-of-life care can truly feel. The days bled softly into nights. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender lotion. And in room 12, an elderly woman named Evelyn Carter lay tucked beneath a pale blue blanket, her eyes half open, her breath uneven. Evelyn was 82, a retired schoolteacher, sharp-minded until the very end, and dying of advanced congestive heart failure. The doctors had given her 3 days, maybe less. Her daughter, Laura, came every evening, bringing small comforts, old records, photo albums, and the lavender lotion her mother loved. She would rub it gently into Evelyn's hands, the same hands that had once written lesson plans and graded papers for decades. Sarah Miller had been Evelyn's primary nurse for almost 2 weeks. By then, Sarah was accustomed to the slow, painful decline that marked her patient's final days. In 10 years, she'd learned to build a wall between her emotions and her duties. "You can't carry every death home with you," she used to say. But Evelyn was different. She had a calmness about her. Not the resigned silence of someone defeated by illness, but a quiet peace, as if she already knew something that no one else did. She often spoke about her husband, William, who had passed 20 years earlier, and she spoke often, always with that same serene tone of someone waiting by the river. At first, Sarah assumed it was symbolic. Many patients find comfort in metaphors near the end, light, bridges, gardens, rivers. It's the mind's way of making peace. But the way Evelyn said it was different. "He's there," she'd whisper, "by the water." "He's been patient." Sarah would smile softly, check her vitals, and respond with the same warmth she offered all her patients. "Then he'll be glad to see you." Medically, Evelyn was declining exactly as expected. Her heart was weak. Fluid had built up in her lungs, making each breath sound like a slow tide, pulling away from shore. Morphine helped ease the discomfort. Sarah would monitor the dosage carefully, explaining in calm tones how it worked. "It's not to hasten anything," she'd assure Laura. "It's just to make her comfortable." She watched for the signs she knew too well: the mottled skin on Evelyn's legs, her slowing pulse, her fading appetite. The human body has a rhythm in death, just as it does in life, and Sarah had learned to read it like a second language. But despite her condition, Evelyn didn't seem afraid. Sometimes she would wake in the middle of the night, eyes open, looking at something unseen. "It's beautiful," she once murmured, tears slipping down her cheeks. Sarah never asked what she saw. Some questions, in hospice, are sacred. What she didn't know then, what no one could have known, was that Evelyn Carter, the woman everyone expected to slip away quietly, was about to defy every law of medicine Sarah had ever learned. Death in medicine isn't a mystery. At least, that's what Sarah Miller had always been taught. It's a process, a sequence of biological events that unfold with predictable precision. When a patient begins to die, the body starts conserving its remaining energy. Blood flow retreats from the extremities toward the core. Hands and feet grow cool, skin turns pale, sometimes blotched with a purplish hue. Breathing slows, heart rate weakens, organs begin to shut down one by one. As Sarah narrates, the visuals shift between the sterile diagrams of a medical textbook and the soft, human scenes of hospice, families whispering their final goodbyes, nurses adjusting pillows, the steady hum of oxygen concentrators. Her voice is steady, calm, explaining what happens when the body reaches the edge. When the heart weakens, she says, it can no longer pump blood efficiently. That lack of oxygen triggers a cascade. Brain activity slows, organs begin to fail, and the body releases endorphins. That's why so many people appear peaceful in their final hours. It's nature's way of easing the pain. Doctors refer to the moments just before death as the active dying phase. The process can last hours or days, but it always ends the same way. The heartbeat stops, the pupils dilate, and the brain flatlines. In modern medicine, this is the end of the story. Consciousness, they say, is a product of the brain, and when the brain stops, so does the person. Yet, every hospice nurse knows there's another phenomenon that defies easy explanation. It's known as the terminal lucidity, or the rally. Patients who have been unresponsive for days sometimes wake up suddenly, alert, coherent, even cheerful. They ask for food. They talk to loved ones. They smile. And then, within hours, they're gone. Sarah had seen it before. She'd watched patients open their eyes one last time, say things that made no sense or seemed to see something no one else could. Science offers theories, brief surges of brain activity, chemical floods triggered by hypoxia. But to those who witness it, it feels like something else entirely. We're trained to measure life by numbers, Sarah reflects softly. By pulse rates, oxygen saturation, electrical activity. But when someone wakes up after being unresponsive, when they speak about seeing light or hearing voices we can't hear, no chart can explain that. In the documentary, a doctor appears briefly, his tone factual. There's no evidence that consciousness survives death, he says. What we see as near-death experiences are likely just the brain's reaction to trauma or lack of oxygen. But Sarah's voice returns, quiet and certain. That may be true. But what happened to Evelyn Carter wasn't a flicker of dying neurons. It wasn't confusion or delirium. It was clarity, purpose. It was impossible. The music fades low, the air heavy with anticipation. No textbook, Sarah says, her voice trembling slightly, ever prepared me for what Evelyn did next. It was just past 2 a.m. when the world inside room 12 seemed to exhale and go still. The rain outside had softened to a whisper, and the glow of the bedside lamp threw faint golden light across the floor. Evelyn Carter had stopped breathing 40 minutes earlier. Her pulse had faded until there was nothing left to find. Sarah Miller had been at her side, one hand resting gently on Evelyn's, waiting for that final confirmation of stillness before calling the time. In her 10 years as a hospice nurse, Sarah had seen hundreds of people pass away. She knew what it looked like, the loosening jaw, the distant eyes, the unmistakable stillness. She'd always thought she understood death. But that night, death didn't behave the way it was supposed to. At first, it was only a feeling, a shift in the air, small but impossible to ignore. Sarah straightened slowly, her instincts sharpening. The rain outside began to fall harder again, tapping insistently against the window. The clock ticked softly in the corner. Then it happened. A sound. A faint inhale. Sarah froze. She looked down, and her breath caught. Evelyn's chest, still for nearly an hour, rose and fell. Once, then again. "Evelyn?" Sarah whispered, disbelief cutting through her exhaustion. She leaned forward, fingers trembling as she searched for a pulse. Nothing at first. Then, faint, fragile, but there, a heartbeat. Her training told her it was impossible. Biological death had already occurred. She had recorded it. Yet here she was, watching life stir where there should be none. Evelyn's eyelids fluttered, then opened. Her gaze was not foggy or confused. It was alert, focused. The color had returned to her cheeks, and her voice, soft but clear, filled the silence. "He's waiting for me at the river." Sarah's knees nearly buckled. "Evelyn, can you hear me?" But Evelyn wasn't looking at her. Her eyes were fixed on something beyond the room, something Sarah couldn't see. "The light," she said quietly. "It's so bright. The water's glowing." Sarah pressed the call button, her heart hammering. The on-duty physician rushed in minutes later, disbelief etched on his face as he checked for vitals. Pulse, weak but present. Blood pressure, inexplicably stable. Respirations, slow, shallow. "She shouldn't be alive," he murmured under his breath. "There's no medical explanation." For 10 surreal minutes, Evelyn spoke softly, calmly, as if halfway between two worlds. She described the scene before her, a wide, sunlit river lined with flowers. A man standing on the opposite shore wearing a hat, waving to her. Her late husband, William. "He says it's not time," Evelyn whispered. "He says I have to go back." Sarah could barely breathe. The doctor stared at the monitors, shaking his head. There was no spike in brain activity, no sudden surge of oxygen. It wasn't a final rally. It was something else, something science didn't have words for. Then, just as suddenly, the light in Evelyn's eyes began to fade. She turned her head toward Sarah and smiled faintly. "Tell Laura," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "I'll see her by the water." Her hand relaxed in Sarah's grasp. The monitor let out one long, steady tone. The doctor lowered his head. Sarah stayed there for a long time, frozen in silence. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The first hint of dawn was breaking through the window, brushing pale light across Evelyn's still face. Her voice, quiet but certain, breaks through the memory. "It wasn't fear," she says. "It wasn't pain. It was release." Morning crept slowly over St. Agnes Hospice, washing the world in a soft gray light. The rain had stopped, leaving streaks of condensation clinging to the windows like tears. The night staff moved quietly through the hallways, changing linens, checking charts, starting another shift in a place where time often felt meaningless. But for Sarah Miller, the world hadn't reset. It had split open. Evelyn Carter was gone, this time for good. The doctor had written the final time of death, a single number on a form that couldn't possibly capture what had happened in that room. To everyone else, it was just another passing in hospice, one of many that week. But to Sarah, it was the moment that unmade everything she thought she knew about dying. She sat beside Evelyn's body longer than usual, her mind replaying the impossible. The pulse that returned, the eyes that opened. The words, "He's waiting for me at the river." It had been so real, too clear to dismiss as a hallucination or a trick of her tired mind. She'd seen the color come back to Evelyn's face. She'd felt warmth in her skin, but now the body before her was motionless again, cold, silent. Sarah found herself whispering to the still air. "What happened to you, Evelyn?" When the attending physician came in later, he said nothing unusual had occurred. "Probably terminal lucidity," he offered gently, scribbling notes on the chart. "It happens sometimes, just before death." His voice carried the detached calm of a man who'd long stopped believing in mystery. Sarah wanted to protest, but the words never came. That evening, as she gathered her things, she caught sight of the lavender lotion Laura had brought. It sat unopened on the bedside table. Sarah hesitated, then tucked it into a small bag with Evelyn's other belongings. 2 days later, Laura returned to collect her mother's things. Her face was tired, swollen from crying, but there was a gentleness in her eyes when she saw Sarah. They sat together for a moment in silence before Sarah finally spoke. "Before your mother passed, she said something. She told me to tell you she'd see you by the water." Laura froze. Tears filled her eyes instantly. "By the water?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "Well, that's where she met my father. There's a river near their old house in Georgia. She always said that's where they'd meet again." The two women sat quietly, tears slipping down their faces, bound by something that neither science nor faith could name. Later that night, Sarah opened a blank notebook. On the first page, she wrote, "Evelyn Carter, the river." Then she began to write down everything she could remember. Not just about Evelyn, but the small, unexplainable things she'd witnessed over the years, the patients who spoke to unseen loved ones, the ones who smiled moments before their last breath, but none had ever come back. For weeks after Evelyn's death, Sarah Miller found herself unable to shake what she'd seen. The hospice continued its quiet rhythm. New patients arrived, others left, the cycle repeating as it always had. But for Sarah, something fundamental had shifted. The science she trusted, the calm certainty that had guided her through a decade of nursing, now felt fragile, cracked. Late at night, long after her shifts ended, she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by open books, printouts, and handwritten notes. The glow of her laptop illuminated tired eyes and trembling fingers. She searched for anything that could explain what she'd witnessed. Near-death experiences, terminal lucidity, resuscitation anomalies. Every keyword led her deeper into a maze of half-answers. She learned about the oxygen-deprived brain and how it can create vivid hallucinations. Scientists said that as neurons die, the brain releases a flood of chemicals, endorphins, DMT, that trigger dreamlike visions, tunnels, lights, long-lost loved ones. To most doctors, these were comforting illusions. the brain's final mercy. But Evelyn's case didn't fit. Sarah hadn't seen a fading patient gasp her final words. She'd seen a woman return. No machines, no CPR, no medication to jolt her awake. She had simply come back. For 10 full minutes, Sarah began speaking with colleagues, quietly at first. Have you ever seen someone wake up after being gone? She'd ask over coffee, careful not to sound unhinged. Most would smile politely, some nervously. A few admitted strange experiences of their own. Patients who spoke to deceased relatives, those who described vivid landscapes moments before passing. But, one nurse said, you can't let it get to you. You'll lose your footing if you try to make sense of it. Still, Sarah couldn't stop. She reached out to researchers studying near-death experiences, reading papers from cardiologists who had revived patients reporting out-of-body awareness. One study claimed nearly 20% of resuscitated individuals described vivid experiences during clinical death. Some recalled conversations in other rooms. Some described scenes later verified by hospital staff. In the documentary, the narration softens as different voices enter, experts from both sides. A neuroscientist explains calmly, what we interpret as consciousness after death is likely just the brain struggling to survive. Those perceptions of light or loved ones, they're chemical illusions, powerful but explainable. Then, a spiritual care chaplain counters gently, but how do you explain awareness when the brain is flatlined? Maybe consciousness isn't just in the brain. Maybe it's something larger, something that leaves and returns. Sarah listens to both, her expression thoughtful but weary. She decides to take a drive one weekend, hours south, to the small Georgia town where Evelyn and her husband once lived. Laura had told her about the river, the place her parents loved, where they'd spent every anniversary. When Sarah finally arrives, the late afternoon sun is low, gold reflecting off the slow-moving water. Standing on the riverbank, she closes her eyes. The air is warm and still, and for a fleeting moment, she swears she feels something, a calm that settles deep in her chest, as if the air itself remembers Evelyn. For years, Sarah says softly, her voice trembling, I thought my job was to help people die, but Evelyn taught me it was to help them cross. She looks out across the water, the current shimmering like liquid light, and whispers, maybe that's what she saw. The story of Evelyn Carter stayed with Sarah Miller long after the paperwork was filed, and her name was crossed off the patient list. Months passed, but Sarah still caught herself thinking about that night, the impossible return of breath, the calm certainty in Evelyn's eyes, the words that echoed long after the room went silent. He's waiting for me at the river. She had tried to explain it to herself 100 different ways. Science, coincidence, fatigue, even wishful thinking. But deep down, Sarah knew it wasn't any of those things. Something had happened in that room that defied every explanation she'd ever trusted. In her voice, there's no drama, only quiet conviction. And when you work in hospice, you learn to accept death as part of the job. You hold hands, you give comfort, you make peace with the inevitable. But Evelyn, she made me question what inevitable really means. The film slows its pace now, almost meditative. We see images of other hospice rooms, candles flickering on bedside tables, family photos tucked under pillows, nurses whispering words of comfort. Life and death side by side, ordinary and sacred all at once. Sarah's narration continues, reflective and warm. I used to believe that death was an ending, if full stop. But Evelyn showed me something else. She showed me that maybe death isn't a door that closes. It's a river that carries us somewhere new. She remembers her final conversation with Laura. The way Laura had smiled through tears, saying, that sounds like her. She always loved that river. Sarah had hugged her, unable to say what she really felt, that she too had seen something that night. Not with her eyes, but with something deeper. As the documentary nears its end, Sarah's voice grows softer, more intimate. We fear what we don't understand. We call it superstition, or brain chemistry, or denial. But what if we're wrong? What if consciousness isn't trapped in our bodies? What if it lingers, just long enough to find its way home? A montage plays, sunlight reflecting on water, the gentle motion of ripples spreading outward, the sound of distant birds, a child's laughter somewhere in the background, all the little signs of life that remind us of something eternal. Sarah continues, in my 10 years as a hospice nurse, I've seen pain, peace, and everything in between. But Evelyn Carter, she was different. She didn't fight death. She met it with recognition, like she'd been there before. The camera lingers on the river at dawn. Mist curls above the surface, golden light breaking through the trees. Sarah's voice, quiet but resolute, delivers the final words. We spend our lives fearing the unknown. But maybe the unknown isn't something to fear. Maybe it's where love waits for us. Maybe that's what Evelyn saw. She pauses. The sound of the river grows louder, soothing, endless. And then one last question, soft, haunting, and full of wonder. If consciousness can outlast the body even for a moment, what does that say about what we truly are? The water glimmers under the rising sun. The screen fades to white. Silence.